Good morning, everyone. Good morning. And welcome to the Grove. I want to take just a minute to say a word of thanks and praise about our worship team. We have been so blessed as we begin this search for a new worship and youth minister in Angie's absence. We have tremendous volunteers who are talented and can fill that void, and I feel very blessed to have them here. And so thank you to all of our worship team and to those who help out with youth group as well. All of your efforts are greatly appreciated. Let me ask you this morning, what makes you happy? What brings a smile to your face and joy to your heart? We might think it would be money or power or fame. We fantasize about going on that tropical vacation or about buying a luxury car or maybe winning the lottery and being able to do whatever we want whenever we want. But according to a new survey, we don't actually need any of that stuff in order to find happiness. Rather, it's the simple things that really make us feel fabulous. A UK healthcare group named Bupa, which is a kind of a weird name, sponsored the survey that asked 2,000 people what brought them happiness. And they compiled all of the top 50 most common answers, and they include things like this: the feeling of the sun on your face, finding a $5 bill in your jacket pocket, the one that you haven't worn since last winter, you put that on, the smell of fresh baked bread, a random act of kindness from a stranger, snuggling on the sofa with your spouse, finding a good bargain, freshly brewed coffee in the morning. It'd be Pepsi in my case, preferably from Casey's. Waking up before the alarm clock and realizing you still have more time to sleep. I like that one too. Seeing a rainbow. Laughing so hard it hurts. Popping bubble wrap. That was actually in the top 50 most common. That seems like a strange thing to me. You guys just sit around at home popping bubble wrap whenever you get a package? Watching your breath float away in cold air. I thought that was neat. Dancing like no one's watching. And in my case, I really hope no one's watching. And the list just goes on and on with things like that. And I would add my own things to it, like the sound of my children laughing, or the feeling of a hot shower, warm chocolate chip cookies right out of the oven, or sitting in a movie theater beside my wife watching the newest superhero movie. That always brings joy to my heart. And I'm sure you guys could fill up a list of at least 50 of these things on your own. Just the simple things that bring you joy and happiness. There's so many of these little things that bring joy to our hearts. But if our happiness depends solely on things of this sort, then what happens when the sun is hidden by gray clouds? Or your pockets are empty? Or the Pepsi's flat? Or the kids are screaming instead of laughing? Often our joy disappears and disappointment and discontentment set in. And not surprisingly, the Bible has a lot to say about happiness. It speaks of indomitable joy as a fruit of God's Spirit welling up in the life of a believer. Joy that runs deeper and stronger because it's anchored not in our circumstances or in our successes, but in the love of God and in the person of Jesus. The Apostle Paul had a lot to say about that kind of joy. In fact, his letter to the Philippians is often referred to as the epistle of joy. The Philippians experienced a special relationship with Paul, and so he wrote them a personal letter expressing his joy and emphasizing the real joy of the Christian life to them. And the words joy or rejoice appear no less than 16 times in just 4 short chapters. And the pages just radiate with this positive message, culminating in Paul's exhortation in Philippians 4, verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Celebrate, be happy, rejoice, he says. And what makes Paul's words even more profound, I think, is that he wrote this letter from a Roman prison awaiting trial and possible execution. That's the setting in which he writes this letter about rejoicing. And that's the dominant theme of his writing here. Now, I don't know about you, but I could use more of that kind of joy in my life. And so for the next few weeks, I'd like to dive into the book of Philippians and see what we can learn about experiencing joy in the midst of our messy, mixed up world. And in the first chapter, I see at least 3 lessons that we can glean from Paul's writing about experiencing joy. First, Paul reminds us to focus on partnerships. Focus on partnerships. Like I said before, Paul had a special relationship with the church in Philippi, and he highlights that relationship in verses 3 through 5, where he says, "Every time I think of you, I give thanks to my God. Whenever I pray, I make my requests for all of you with joy, for you have been my partners in spreading the good news about Christ." See, this is the first appearance of the word joy in this letter, and just the thought of their friendship stirred feelings of thankfulness and joy in Paul's heart. He remembered them in his prayers with joy because they had partnered together in sharing the gospel and building God's church. And even though he was miles away and wrongfully imprisoned, he felt joy because he knew that there were people who loved him and cared for him. Later, Paul mentions the care packages that the Philippians had sent to him there in jail and how much he appreciated them. Partnerships, relationships, can be a tremendous source of joy in our lives. In fact, a positive psychology guru, Martin Seligman, studied happiness, and he found several characteristics that were common among people who were happy. You know, people who checked the survey and said, "I'm happy all the time," kind of deal. You know, these people shared certain traits in common. And the number one trait is that happy people spend time with others. They spend the least amount of time alone. Friendships and meaningful relationships bring us joy. On the other hand, loneliness is one of the biggest barriers to joy. You know, there are 300 million of us here in the United States now, and sometimes it seems like we're all friends on Facebook, but the reality is that Americans are lonelier than they've ever been. Surveys show that 1 out of every 4 people feels lonely at any given moment in time. And of Americans who ate dinner last night, 22% ate alone. Loneliness largely affects children and teenagers. College students are a big one. Newly married couples, mothers, and especially senior citizens. Really, it seems like everybody gets affected by it at some point in their life. I recently read a newspaper ad that highlights just how lonely people can get. The ad ran in a Kansas newspaper personal section, and it said simply, "I will talk to or listen to you talk for 30 minutes without comment for $5. 30 minutes without comment for $5. It sounds like a joke, but it wasn't. People actually started calling. And pretty soon, this woman who put this ad in the paper said that she had 10 to 20 calls a day just listening to people talk. See, the pain of loneliness is so sharp that people are willing to try anything just for half an hour of companionship. People long to connect, to enjoy meaningful relationships. And really, I think that's why God gave us church. And that's why we exist. Paul, he was either divorced or widowed, we're not sure which, but he didn't have a spouse anymore. He had no children that we know of, but no matter where he went, he had family. He had his church family. He had people who loved him and cared about him. And I think that brought him great joy. And there's a couple different lessons in there for us. First, whenever loneliness starts to set in and you start experiencing that and it's stealing your joy, focus on your partnerships. You know, think about somebody, hopefully here in the church, that you haven't spent some time with in a while. Give them a call. Go out. Have some coffee. Spend some time with people that bring you joy. But then secondly, we need to be on the lookout for people that are susceptible to loneliness. You know, there's a lot of folks that experience that on a regular basis. You don't have to be sitting in a Roman jail to experience loneliness. And they don't wear signs. They don't usually raise their hand when you say, "Is anybody here lonely?" And so we need to be looking for those people and trying to connect with them Because just by spending a little bit of time with them and enjoying each other's company, we can inject a little joy into their lives. So the first key to genuine joy is focusing on partnerships. Furthermore, Paul shows that we can experience joy by focusing on the positive. Focus on the positive, he shows us. Paul continues, and in verses 12 through 18, he says this, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it's become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It's true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this, I rejoice." So here's the situation. For 24 hours a day, this is how Paul's prison time was spent. He was chained to a Roman soldier. And he lived in a house and he was free to kind of walk around town and stuff like that. But he was chained to this soldier all day long. And the soldiers took about 6-hour shifts. So every 6 hours, a new soldier would come, they'd unchain, and they'd rechain to the new soldier. And you know, most people would see this as a horrible thing, but not Paul. Paul thought this was a wonderful opportunity to share with the soldiers about Jesus. See, they chained up to him so that the prisoner couldn't escape, but Paul was in a situation now where his audience couldn't escape. You know, he had a captive audience that he could share Jesus with all day long. And some of these guys actually ended up accepting Jesus and changing their whole lives. And as a result, the believers in town could preach the gospel more openly without fear of the Roman soldiers. Because now a lot of the Roman soldiers were Christians. And so they could share all these good things were happening because Paul was in chains 24 hours a day. But then this other problem arose. Some of these preachers were just doing it to make a name for themselves. Paul says out of jealousy and rivalry. You know, they wanted to see who was the best preacher, who could build the biggest audience, all that kind of stuff. I don't know what was going on, but it wasn't good. And Paul just looks at that situation and he says, who cares? Yeah, either way, whatever their motive is, they're preaching Jesus. And that made them happy because the people's lives were being changed. Paul was the ultimate optimist. You know, he found reasons to rejoice where most of us would just find reasons to grumble and complain. The same study that I mentioned earlier by Martin Seligman also found that no matter what happens, happy people stay optimistic. They just look on the bright side of things. They look at the glass as half full instead of half empty. I read this week about a young woman named Kate who was driving with her father when he showed her what it really means to look on the bright side of things. As they were driving along, they ran over some debris in the road, and a moment later they heard that all too familiar thump, 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 thump coming from the back of the car, and they knew they had blown a tire. And Kate's face just sank, like, this is another thing that I need to happen to me right now. And her dad, on the other hand, he lit up. He said, oh, this is great. I've been meaning to teach you how to change a tire, and now's the perfect opportunity. That is about the weirdest response I've ever heard to car trouble. But it's also a perfect example of how much power we have over our own point of view. You know, our happiness isn't really about the situation that we find ourselves in, but about how we see that situation. Now, our perspective is everything. No matter how rough a day that we've had or how hard a year it's been, there's always a different way to look at it. And if you want to experience more joy in life, then you have to focus on the positive. Look at the bright side, the silver lining. There's good news there if you choose to find it. You know, yes, maybe your car broke down, but the good news is you had a cell phone and you could call for help. Or yes, maybe you're stuck at home with the flu, but the good news is now you have an excuse to binge watch your favorite shows on Netflix. You know, whatever the situation is, you can find something good and something positive in it. You might have to dig a little deeper sometimes, but so much of your happiness is in your own hands. It's your choice. Paul could have seen his chains as a problem, but he chose to see them as an opportunity. He could have complained about these, money-grubbing, popularity-hoarding preachers, but instead he chose to rejoice because Jesus was being preached. It just takes actively seeing your situation from a brighter, more positive perspective. So focus on partnerships. Secondly, focus on the positive. And finally, Paul shows us that we can experience joy by focusing on our purpose. Focus on your purpose. There's a story involving Yogi Berra, the well-known catcher for the New York Yankees, and Hank Aaron, who at the time was the chief power hitter for the Milwaukee Braves. And the teams were playing in the World Series, and as usual, if you know anything about Yogi Berra, he just can't stop running his mouth. And so he's chattering the whole time that players are up to bat, and that's partly to encourage his team and partly to distract the batters from the other team. And so Hank Aaron gets up there, and he steps up to the plate, and he's got his bat on his shoulder, and Yogi starts chattering, and he tells him, "Hey, Hank, you're holding the bat wrong." Hank just looks back at him and ignores him. He says, "Hank, you're holding the bat wrong. You got to turn it so that you can read the label. You got to be able to read it, Hank." And Hank just ignores him, doesn't do anything. Pitch comes, swings, and knocks it way out into the stadium in left field. Runs the bases, comes back, drops the bat at Yogi Berra's feet. He says, "I didn't come here to read." See, Hank Aaron knew what he was there to do, and he wasn't going to let anything distract him. He had a purpose, and he fulfilled that purpose. He stayed focused on it. And that's what Paul did. Near the end of the chapter, he writes this in verses 21 through 26. He says, "To me, the only important thing about living is Christ, and dying would be profit for me. If I could continue living in the body, I'll be able to work for the Lord. If I do not know what to choose, living or dying, it's hard to choose between the two. I want to leave this life and be with Christ, which is much better, but you need me here in the body. Since I'm sure of this, I know that I will stay with you to help you grow and have joy in your faith. You will be very happy in Christ Jesus when I am with you again." See, Paul had a clear sense of purpose in life. Jesus was everything to him, and as such, he had a mission to accomplish. He wanted to see the Philippian church grow in their faith and be happy in Jesus. And that purpose brought him great joy. The Nobel Prize-winning playwright George Bernard Shaw once said, "This is the true joy in life, being used for a purpose, recognized by yourself as a mighty one. Being thoroughly worn out before you're thrown on the scrap heap, and being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world did not devote itself to making you happy." He was right. There's great joy, I think, in being used for a mighty purpose. And in Christ, we all have a purpose. That purpose may manifest in different ways depending on who you are. It may result in different careers. But it all comes down to living for Christ. I'm reminded of the old acronym JOY. Jesus, others, and yourself. If you keep things in that order, then your life will overflow with joy. Now, I'm grateful for Paul's epistle of joy. And I don't know if your life has been joyful or joyless lately. But one thing I know is that joy is a choice. Regardless of your situation or your circumstances, you can choose to focus on partnerships. You can choose to focus on the positive, and you can choose to focus on your purpose. This week, I want to challenge and encourage you to choose joy. And next week, we'll delve a little deeper into Philippians and see what else we can learn about joy. In the meantime, maybe you could use a little boost of joy. And since joy is a fruit of God's Spirit, one of the best ways to experience more joy is by receiving God's Spirit, accepting Christ as your Savior and being born again into His family. If you haven't done that yet, or if you could just use a refill, I want to encourage you to come and talk with me as we stand and sing together. Let's sing, church.